person's automotive experience is not just limited to the cars that they've owned. There are also many outside influences, and one of the biggest outside influences is family. My dad isn't a car guy per se, more of a fisherman, but he does have some interest in cars. In general, he's anti-Ford and has a soft spot for European cars. A soft spot that has led to an early Renault that he wrapped around a telephone pole while my parents were dating, an incident that my mother only survived because she was thrown through the windshield before the passenger side of the car was crumpled up like an empty potato chip bag. It also included a Jaguar that he purchased when he was stationed overseas and still regrets to this day not being able to bring it back with him, as well as a Triumph Spitfire that he refers to as the most expensive lawn ornament he's ever owned, as it spent more time in the shop as it ever did on the road. But his tendency is to lean towards GM products, including an overhead cam straight six Le Mans, which may sound European but very definitely isn't. But as a fisherman, his priority has been the ability to tow a boat, which early on meant a string of large American cars. As a kid, I loved these cars. In the age before seatbelt laws, a 6-foot wide bench seat is a playground or a good place to take a nap, even if you don't have the whole thing to yourself. The exception here was a short experience with a convertible. Now, in music videos in Southern California, these cars appear to be a rolling party, but 1,000 miles further north, my experience was being sandblasted by a cold wind as my circle of word puzzle book flew away. But big cars and towing continued on into the 80s, when necessity forced the move to trucks, although there have been an occasional SUV squeezed into the mix, ranging from a Scout 2 to a Jeep Liberty, and as was the trend, he tended to lean towards GM products with the occasional Mopar squeezed in, including one purple V10 Dodge. Even though the trucks transitioned from extended cab to crew cab, big trucks don't make great around-town vehicles, which necessitated a second vehicle, usually a generic-ish sedan with some reasonable size, but also included the Sebring coupe that we eventually got from him. My mom doesn't drive, but she has given it a shot periodically, which included getting her permit when she was a teenager and a '63 Corvair. And although she didn't get her driver's license, the Corvair stuck around for more than a decade in the family, and I still remember my grandfather using it as a work car when I was a kid. While I was still knee-high to a grasshopper, she decided to give it a shot again, but while my uncle was trying to teach her how to drive in his Volkswagen Beetle, another driver hit them, caving in the passenger side door and putting an end to that experience. Temp 3 came while I was in high school, when her best friend purchased a new Mitsubishi Galant and offered to sell Mom her Pinto super cheap. But like the previous experiences, that never went beyond a permit, and the Pinto ended up in the hands of her friend's daughter. Then she bought a Ford Falcon Econoline, thinking that if she fixed it up, it would motivate her to get her license. But ultimately, that just ended up as a storage shed in the backyard. So she bought a Toyota Celica GT liftback, a car that prior to this point I had really liked. But this one only ran for a couple of days before leaving them stranded and ended up parked in my driveway for about 8 months. After sorting through numerous electrical problems that ranged from a kill switch someone had installed under the dash to prevent the battery from draining off overnight, to an extra negative battery cable that was attached on one end and hanging down underneath the car on the other end. But once it was running reasonably well, they sold it without ever coming to pick it up. They includes the stepdad, which also deserves some credit for influence, which ranges from being allowed to steer a '56 Chevy pickup before I was tall enough to reach the pedals, a '71 Oldsmobile Delta 88 police car, nicknamed Shasta, and a variety of dirt track racing at Lebanon Speedway in Oregon. After my grandfather drove the Corvair into the ground, it was replaced by a 1952 Chevy Deluxe sedan that my great-grandfather had bought new. And when my grandfather passed away, my grandmother donated that car to the local high school's auto shop class because she didn't think anybody would be interested in it. My grandmother, who I associate with large white Impalas, but in the mid-'80s opted to downsize to a blue Corolla because she no longer needed a family car. But the real influence in the family was my uncle, whom my brother and I would occasionally spend time with in the summertime. He owned a couple of hydraulics shops in the Newport Bay and Eugene Springfield area. And although most of his business was focused on things such as fishing boats and garbage trucks, there was a certain hot rod environment involved, particularly when it came to lowriders. He had a Toyota pickup that he'd put a tilt bed on, as well as some Subaru Brat jump seats, where I spent time losing name that car to my cousin. But we were exposed to several adventures on these visits that ranged from dirt biking in the mountains to crashing his modified Honda Odyssey. At the Florence sand dunes, he tried to teach me how to drive clutch in his Jeep Honcho Gladiator, but it didn't work out as I was still too short to depress the pedals all the way down. But the big thing he introduced us to was drag racing, of virtually every type, from classics such as a pair of Stutz Bearcats to the big rigs of the mother truckin' drags. And not just to watch, but we also got to ride along. Now I have 3 brothers and 2 sisters, but only the middle one, who spent time with me at my uncle's, would also become a car guy. And he's owned a number of interesting cars, and although he claims to be a Ford guy, his car history would suggest otherwise, and his car projects tend to be far more radical than mine, ranging from attempting to put gull-wing doors on an Econoline van to slapping a Dodge Dart GT on top of a 51 International dump truck chassis, and then replacing the 273 with a 440. For his current project, he's attempting to 4-buy a Fiero. And just as parents can be an influence to children, children can bring automobiles into the household as well. This has included a couple of Neons and at least one minivan, but it was son number 2 that was the car guy. And as mentioned in previous videos, we did a number of trading back and forth with him, but also included other such cars as a Grand Wagoneer that he tried to Dukes-a-Hazzard over a roadblock, crumpling the front fenders as that sort of stunt always does, and after breaking windows out, trying to take it through places in the forest where something that big wasn't meant to go, traded it straight across for a Ford Tempo with high mileage and 0 maintenance. It still had the original spark plugs in it, and every one of them broke off when we tried to change them. But when car parts and tools disappeared from the garage, I knew precisely who to ask. That's not to say that his older brother wasn't also part of the picture. For his first car, he'd bought a Datsun 620 pickup from a friend of his, but while installing a stereo in it, he accidentally turned it to on instead of auxiliary, and as this predates the clutch lockout switch, the car leapt forward into the back of his mother's Valiant. Did absolutely no damage to the 5-mile-an-hour bumper on the Valiant, but completely caved in the entire front end of the Datsun. Fenders, bumper, grille, hood, the whole thing. So he upgraded to a Dodge Shadow ES, the model that looks like the Turbo, but isn't. And a car that he broke the plastic clip to the sunroof. And although he tried various ways to strap it down, it was only a matter of time till the whole thing flew away while going down the highway. And then he got the first of the Neons to show up in our driveway. A car that one of his friends drove off a cliff into a tree. And I don't mean he hit the tree. I mean it literally landed in a tree and had to be towed out of the tree back to the road. And before I wrap this video up, I'd like to give a quick nod to in-laws. As stated in previous videos, we got a number of cars from our in-laws and have borrowed a number of cars from in-laws, such as my previous mother-in-law's purple Chevette, a car that she traded for a 79 Malibu straight 6 that seemed like a huge upgrade, but sticks in my mind mostly because when borrowing it for a trip to the coast, I got a speeding ticket for doing 58 and a 55, a car that she traded for a slightly newer Buick Regal with a V6 that she absolutely loved, thought it was the best car that she'd ever owned, so much so that when it finally started to nickel and dime her to death, she bought a newer Buick Regal, which eventually was passed down to one of the boys. And we also got a number of cars from my father-in-law, who has and does have a number of interesting vehicles, but his primary mode of transportation for the last couple of decades has been a series of Toyota hybrids, something that I'm at least partially to blame for. Way back in the 90s, he asked me what I would buy similar to a Toyota Camry, to which I responded, what would I buy or what would I recommend? What's the difference? The Camry of the period was one of the most reliable cars you could buy, a nicely equipped, competitive car for a reasonable price with a high resale value. Why wouldn't I recommend a Camry in that segment? but I would never buy one. It's the king of beige, about as anti-car guy as a car can be, a sheep in sheep's clothing. Then he asked me what I thought of hybrids, and I said it's the future of the automobile, and that I hoped they succeeded because it would be a shame if it failed. And of course the Prius was a success, but he's purchased something like 3 of them, just recently upgrading to a Camry hybrid. And as anyone who's ever driven a Prius knows, why wouldn't you? Now, of course, there are people and vehicles that I have left out of this video, which I hope no one will take offense to, but it's starting to run long. So, as always, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment below. Thanks.